You are listening to Hard House History with Paul Glazby.
Mark Kavanagh, the Irish legend. Welcome to Hard House History.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So obviously we were just chatting just before we started. Let's pick up from what you were just saying.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you, was I the first sort of non-UK guest that you had on the show? But you were telling me that Fergie was on a couple of hours before me, or
yes,
you recorded that at least. And I was just saying, the last couple of days, it kind of struck me that Hard House, it was very much a British thing, and it never really sort of moved into other territories. Now, I know there's people probably watching going, there was lots of Dutch hard house and German hard house and what have you, but what I mean is the actual scene and what we know as the hard house scene, it very much did stay confined to within sort of Britain and Ireland. Obviously, there was a big scene in Ireland. There isn't really now, but there was. So, yeah, I was just wondering, had you had anyone else on outside the UK? So it's only me and Fergie so far, is it?
Yeah, it would be. I mean, Baby Doc, he lives in Germany, but he's English. Trying to think. It was interesting, actually, because when Dave the drummer came on, his episode, like we can see like the geographical locations of where people have viewed. And typically, you know, like Andy Farley, for example, his episode would be 98% UK and Ireland. Maybe 2% Australia, and that's probably it. Whereas Dave the drummer, he had like Venezuela, Brazil. You know, there were people all around the world that were watching it.
Yeah.
Which, you know, that was a reflection of how the scene is for, you know, acid techno compared to hard house. Yeah.
Dave and Chris were regular sort of visitors to Ireland back in the. Or they still are now. They still come now. But the clubs that they played were always sort of separate to the hard house clubs. Even when hard house was at its peak, you might have, you know, 2 or 3 hard house nights on in Dublin, say between 98 and 2002. And Dave and Chris might have been playing in Dublin regularly during that period, but it was never in those same clubs. It was always in their own kind of, I wouldn't call them acid techno clubs, but they had a completely different following, a completely different crowd, a very sort of hippie-ish crowd, maybe.
Yeah, when Chris came on, I was asking him if he'd ever played, which I thought he had, a night called Head Charge, which was at the Arches in Sheffield, where I first started my career. And obviously, you know, the nights that we did were hard house, but these acid techno nights, all the, you know, people with like tie-dye and dreadlocks, and it was a completely different crowd there. But the music, you know, the energy of the music was similar. But yeah, very different. As we just said before, like you're about 10 years older than me. So when did you, like, how old were you when you got into, like, how did you end up getting into the hard house scene? Were you like an Andy Farley that was sort of doing stuff before the scene?
Yeah. I mean, the first hard house record, or the first record under my own name that I recorded was in 1997, 1998. And TDV actually offered to sign that for his label, but it never happened. It was actually on St. Patrick's Day in 1998. I got a fax asking me if I wanted to sign the track to his label. It didn't happen because of his untimely demise. I wasn't friends with Tony. I didn't know Tony like your other Irish guest Fergie would have, but there would be Tony links to elements of my story that sort of will help you join the dots from when I started to sort of when people in the UK, most of your hard house history fan base would know me from, which will be from sort of 98 on. I was the first promoter to bring Tony to play in the south of Ireland, which was in 1996. Now, it wasn't a particularly amazing night. It was the wrong DJ in the wrong venue on the wrong night, but it sort of opened up a relationship, and it was good to get him over. The south, we had a very different scene to the north of Ireland at the time. I'm sure Fergie has talked about how wild the clubs in Northern Ireland were in that era. They used to like open at 8 in the evening, and they all had to close at 1. There was a curfew because of the Troubles.
Right. Yeah.
So people tended to go out early and really, made the most of those nights to kind of as their release from everything that was going on around them. And so Tony would have visited the north of Ireland quite a bit in sort of the mid-90s, but in the south, his first gig was in 1996. And his last gig was actually late in 1997, and there was only a handful of shows. People forget that, I suppose it's a testament to his legacy that Tony's career only really kicked off in 1995 when Burning Up was released on PWL. And so it was a 3-year career. Himself and Simon recorded like more than 100 tracks and remixes in that time. They were very prolific in terms of production and remixing. And in terms of DJing, he was probably the busiest DJ in the UK in 1997, even ahead of the likes of Superclub DJs like Judge Jules and Jeremy Healy. But yeah, his Irish shows, the ones that did happen, not that very first one, but the ones that did happen after that were momentous, My story began much earlier. Like, Andy Farley, I was sort of a DJ in mainstream discos and clubs in the late 80s. And around that time, sort of all the Italo house was kicking off, things like Black Box and Starlight Numero Uno. And we used to play a lot of that kind of stuff, but there was a lot of sort of cheesy pop music as well. And then sort of 1990 just happened to be sort of right place, right time, as is the case with a lot of people involved in the club scene. I kind of noticed there was something new happening, more so in the UK. There wasn't really an awful lot going on in Ireland at that time. There were a couple of clubs in the late 80s. McGonagall's is one, where they used to bring over DJs from London, and it was cutting edge stuff, and it was a mix of hip hop and a mix of house and acid house, people like Cold Cut. And I felt that someone should be documenting it. So I approached a magazine in Dublin. It was just a Dublin entertainment guide, and asked them, could I do a sort of a clubbing column to kind of chart this incoming new thing. It wasn't called the rave scene at that time. People were still calling it the acid house scene, I suppose, in 89, 1990. And that just worked in my favor. I ended up doing a fanzine as well as doing magazine columns. In the early 90s, somebody actually put up a post recently online about the fanzine, saying that it was a valiant attempt to kind of document that there was a bit of a scene in Dublin happening at the time. Everything from buying records to where the club nights were and who the DJs were. But it was a very, very small scene. It was nothing like what was going on in the UK. There were, I suppose, the pivotal people in the early days, for me anyway, were people like Johnny Moy and Patter Redmond. Those names probably don't mean anything to anyone watching in the UK, but Johnny was a big name in the UK in the 90s. But he had been in London with a guy called Patter Redmond, and they sort of came back and they started running nights, small club nights, midweek nights, wherever they could get a venue to let them put in a sound system and some DJs playing all this wild new music. And he ran a gig in what became the biggest sort of rave venue in the city, the Olympic Ballroom. And that was in 1990. It was called Orbit. And I was the warm-up DJ at that gig. And, he sort of, I wouldn't say he invited me onto the lineup for my musical skills. Certainly wasn't my mixing skills, but it was more the fact that I was doing the fanzine and I was doing magazine columns, and it was a chance to maybe highlight what they were doing. So a strange sort of way that it worked out. I actually played the very first record and the very first night in that rave venue, the Olympic Ballroom, but then I ended up becoming the resident DJ there for a couple of years, and I ended up playing the last record on the last night. And that place was just like another world. It was 1,400 people most Saturday nights. It started off like that first night, there was maybe a couple of hundred people. And then they put another one on a couple of weeks later. May not have been Johnny and Patter put on the next one, but other promoters went in. And there was maybe 5 or 6 events run by independent promoters. And over the course of those events, it took off, and it was getting 800-900 people. And the owner of the venue then did what some owners do, and he pushed out all the independent promoters and started running the nights himself. But it just skyrocketed. In some people's eyes, it became more commercial because it was so big and there was so many people. Like some nights, it was way over the 1,400 that they were allowed put in the venue. This was a venue that was used for sort of live gigs and music gigs and what have you. But it was just another world. I'd never seen anything like it. I'd gone from DJing in mainstream clubs where you had slow sets and you were on the mic all the time to nights where they expected almost every record that you played had to be a new record. And every week, I was lucky in the early days. I got on to all the mailing lists, the big mailing lists like Hyperactive and Power Promotions. So I used to get sent everything. So each week, like, you had a treasure trove of a couple of dozen brand new promos that nobody else in the city had. As I said, again, it was a small scene at the time. It didn't mushroom very quickly, but in those early days, that first year or two, 1990, 1991, there was maybe a handful of DJs playing the music, and certainly only, you know, one or two nights every week where you would hear that sort of music on a regular basis. So that was sort of the start of it. The first big turning point for me when I started making music was a chance encounter with someone that you may know as Mr. Spring. You probably know his Voyager record from Manifesto, or maybe and I think a lot of people in the UK would know that. He made lots of other brilliant records besides. In hindsight, that wasn't necessarily his best tune, but it is the one he's probably best known for. He put an ad in my fanzine, and he was advertising that he had just bought the new Voyager Gold sequencer. He had, technically speaking, a 1,000 track studio, and he was trying to attract new business. And we got chatting, and it turned out we were both into 80s sort of synth pop. We were both big fans of New Order, Depeche Mode, Human League. And then one night he just rang me up, and he was playing the Human League Sound of the Crowd down the phone. And he said, "Would you like to come out and do a remix of this?" So I did, and that sort of was a big turning point in my life. We did in hindsight, horrendous breakbeat version of Human League Sound of the Crowd. And we ended up calling ourselves, when we got to release that record after a while, we called ourselves Sound Crowd. And that record was made in a shed out in his parents' garden. That was sort of in the middle of 1992. And we were probably the first people at the time. I'm not saying it was the first Irish dance record. There were a couple before that. Timmy himself had done one, and that's probably the first Irish house record was called Carrier Frequency, and he released that himself a couple of years previously. But in terms of actually a DJ in a club in Ireland putting out a record that was made for that club, we were probably the first ones to do it. We were the first ones to do that. There's no two ways about it. And we over the next couple of years, we ended up recording, like, I'd say well over 100 tracks and released a lot of them. And in hindsight, I think everyone was probably guilty of this in the 90s. We released a lot of records we probably shouldn't have released. The quality control, you were just so excited making a tune, and you just sort of tended to put everything out. And recently we started putting some of them up on the streaming services, and it was kind of like, you listen back to them and you kind of go, "Oh, what were we thinking of when we put that out?"
Yeah, I've been there.
But I could talk about that for hours, and there's probably no point because it's not really relevant to the history of Hard House. But from those early records, what happened was we were new to this whole scene. Timmy approached this guy that was looking to get involved in the dance scene. He was kind of like a music business manager. Sean Brennan was his name, and he was instrumental in sort of getting everything moving. And we asked him, would he finance putting a record out? We did another breakbeat track called Stop, and then we did the one that changed everything was a track called Fifth Season. So Timmy had done this single called Telephonia, and he asked me to come out and remix it. I just copied the arrangement of a track that was huge in the Olympic Ballroom at the time, and it just clicked. We did it in like about 2 hours. You know, the way sometimes you can spend days on a track and it goes nowhere, but this one just happened. And that sort of just made us determined to kind of do something and put it out. And anyone we played it to was like, "Oh yeah, that's really different." It was very orchestral, which is why we call it Fifth Season. It was some sort of play on Vivaldi's Four Seasons. So we did that, and then we did the last track on that EP was horrendous. It was sort of a new order tribute tune, and we basically just pressed up 500 white labels ourselves. We got in touch with various distributors in the UK. We were reading in Mixmag and DJ all about how you know these guys go around vans at record shops in London and they sell all your white labels for you. And that's what we did. And within the space of a couple of days, we sold 500 records. We took 100 of that 500 back to Ireland, and the other 400 went to, I think, 3 different UK distributors. Now, the reality was, and maybe you experienced this yourself, when you were running labels, but distributors weren't always the most successful businessmen, so they were a bit like us. They were making it up as they went along. And a couple of months later, we may have sold 500 records, but we didn't actually get any money for it. The ones that were sold in the UK were either ripped off or the distributors went bust. We got 100 of those tunes back into Ireland. We sold those out again. And that just sort of inspired us to do another record. And when we've made that first tune, Fifth Season, it reminded Timmy of probably one of the biggest anthems in the Olympic Ballroom at the time, which was a Scottish trance record called Energy Rush by Suburban Delay.
Okay.
And he said, let's do that next. And there was a big, long, sort of moody trance bit in the middle of that record. And Timmy had this clever idea to mash it up with another record from the Olympic Ballroom, which was Usura's Open Your Mind. It hadn't been a big pop chart hit at the time, but it was a big hit in the club. So we got the original Simple Minds record, New Gold Dream. We sampled that. And we created what I suppose in hindsight was Ireland's first mashup. And it was Energy Rush. And just coincidentally, that particular year, 1993, that would have been, there was a couple of new pirate stations starting off in Dublin. Sunset FM was one of them. I was a DJ on another pirate radio station called DLR, which was hugely influential. Used to have a kind of a 4-hour show on a Friday evening, just playing all the brand new promos. And those 2 pirate radio stations, and I think Club FM started around the same time, they just took to Energy Rush, and every time you turned on the radio, that tune was on for the whole of that summer. And we just took off. We went from being a couple of guys making tunes in a shed to this kind of hot new act, as people in the music industry were calling us, who were making this newfangled electronic music on computers. And just the interest in us soared. We started getting booked for loads of gigs. We started making loads and loads and loads of tunes. And maybe the first dot to join with the hard house bit of the story is the B-side of that record, Energy Rush. There were 2 tracks on it. One was inspired by the Prodigy's Android, and the other one was a track called Pleasure Girl, which basically sampled a Malcolm Duffy record. So the Malcolm Duffy record in question was the remix of E17's Deep. Can't remember if it was Deep or Deeper. Now that's one of those tracks we should never have put out. It's up on the streaming services for everyone to laugh at if they want. But it was so Malcolm's stuff at that time. He was doing the disco stuff, which you probably remember. Another one that he did around the same time, 92, 93, was Zero B's Lockup, which went on to be released by Triple E Tracks about 10 years later. But I used to play Zero B Lockup in the Olympic Ballroom. And it kind of, you notice that all of these discus records by Malcolm, and I think it was Andronicus was the other half of the studio partnership. I think anything they did sort of was really, really good, and I really, really liked it. So that was maybe the first time I encountered the trade name. So yeah, the name of that club was starting to sort of, be noticed, if you like. Yeah. So SoundCloud took off, and we it was a short-lived thing as well, where by 1995 we'd sort of peaked. We did a gig. We played like a big Irish music festival in 1994, Fela. I started getting booked, as Timmy wasn't DJing at that time, and I was getting booked for a lot of DJ gigs. Based on the radio show, the Olympic Ballroom, and just sort of being a known name, if you like, in the south. From where Fergie was in the north of Ireland, people up there wouldn't have necessarily been aware of anything that was going on in the south, and vice versa. We weren't, apart from David Holmes and Ian McCready were huge Belfast DJs with huge followings in the south. But the scene that, say, Fergie would have been, the clubs that he would have been going to, the likes of Met Arena, and the DJs like Jacko and Glazby Dublin and Robbie Nelson, they weren't really well known down in the south at that particular time. So I was getting huge support act gigs, like did a tour with the Prodigy, did a tour with Primal Scream, played 3 years running, played the 3 Arena in Dublin with the Prodigy, and that's, at that time, it was a sort of an 8,000-9,000 capacity venue. And then we did 3 Arena ourselves, or Point Depot as it was called, in June 1995, and that was like 10,000 people for what was essentially an Irish lineup. It wasn't 100% an Irish lineup, but it was like us doing a live set, me DJing, an act we'd signed to the label called Liquid Wheel. We had the Prodigy's MC Ruff on the lineup as well. Rest in peace, MC Ruff. He died way too young. He did the MC for the event for us, and we did a couple of other local acts on, some techno DJs on. It was the only time in the history of that venue that they opened up the sort of the balcony with a separate sound system and separate DJs, and we had all the kind of underground techno DJs in the city up there, and it was a special, momentous night. So we'd gone from like playing records in the shed to playing to 10,000 people in the pub in the space of a couple of years.
And you're about 26, 27 at this point?
Yeah, it would have been. Yeah. Timmy was a little bit younger, I think. He's not that much younger, but he was a little bit younger. So yeah, there was lots going on. Like by 1995, Ireland, the Irish dance scene had taken off. In the second half of the decade, it became this huge thing. You know, from a handful of clubs, from a couple of dozen people. Say when I was writing about stuff initially for In Dublin magazine, and they sent me on a kind of a bus trip down to a club called Sir Henry's. We had about 20, 30 people from Dublin. Most of the people on that bus that day, it was an Easter Sunday gig, and they used to do this all-day rave in Sir Henry. So I hired a coach, and a couple of dozen of us went down and spent a day. It was Hassie and the DJs, Mike Pickering and Graham Parker were playing. And I'd say pretty much every person that was on that bus that day became a DJ or became a promoter or got involved in the scene in some way. And, you know, there were other people running buses around then as well. I'm not saying I was the only one. Johnny used to run regular buses up to Sugar Sweet, and he also ran buses to Sir Henry's. But the people who went to those bus trips, that sort of, you know, they mushroomed into the people that, you know, developed the scene over the next couple of years. And you saw, say, the Olympic Ballroom going from, you know, a couple of hundred people the first week to 1,400, 1,500 people every Saturday night for a couple of years. And that was replicated.
Sorry.
That was replicated elsewhere, not just in Dublin. That was, you know, the same thing was happening around the country as well.
Well, it's just making me think, have you ever seen 24-Hour Party People?
I have indeed, yeah.
So, you know, at the beginning where there's, they're at some concert and the camera's sort of going around and it's picking out, I think one of the people in the crowd is like the guy, Mick Hucknall, I think, you know, Simply Red. But they're all like young, you know, like, but it's pointing out all these people. It's a bit like that, you know, like that bus would have been. The Free Trade Hall gig, I think, is the one that you're talking about. The Sex Pistols gig. Yeah, that's it.
It was. It was a little bit like that, and I suppose what was I playing at that stage, and how did that kind of lead to Hard House in the Olympic Ballroom? It was very much. He played everything and anything. Like, it would have a reputation as being a cheesy sort of screaming piano fest. There was a lot of breakbeat stuff. There was a lot of Prodigy. There was a lot of, you know, 140, 150 BPM piano stuff, the sort of stuff that Billy Daniel Bunter was probably raving about on your podcast recently. Billy's one of the most passionate and enjoyable people to listen to talk about music, and that was definitely one of your. I'm not saying I've watched all your podcasts, but it's one of the best ones that I've seen so far. You can listen to Billy all night.
Yeah,
you can listen.
We did.
So yeah, but also in the Olympic, we played things like Underworld Res, which was a game-changing record that was totally out of sync with a lot of the stuff that was played in the Olympic. The Olympic was one of the first places where that was heard. The famous night where it was first played was Darren Emerson played it in Dublin off acetate. But yeah, that was a huge tune. Like, but for SoundCloud and the records we were making and all the records we were releasing, we used to just bring in a DAT machine. We couldn't afford to get acetates done. Paul, this was in the pre-digital era, so we just used to bring in DAT tapes. But essentially, a lot of the time, we just waited. We got stuff done up on test pressing. We didn't, and you bring them in and you try them out, and you kind of just learn from the records that you were making. So we, like, for 2 years, we had the thrill of, like, it's one thing standing in front of 1,000 people and watching the place go off to records that you're playing. But when a good chunk of the records are records that you made or had a hand in making, that elevates the feeling as well. You know, being a producer yourself, it's the best feeling in the world. So in that era, the Malcolm Duffy stuff would have played. In 1994. Myself and Timmy had a record signed to PWL, which was the same label that signed TDV's Burning Up. We signed an act to our label, Red Records, for Rhythm, and they at one point had a track called Burning Up, which they had to cancel because they used the same vocal sample that Tony originally used. The record that was released by Tony doesn't have that vocal sample, but it was a Lolita Holloway sample. But the original mix had that Lolita sample in it.
So Red Records, that was your label. So
there was a UK hard house label called Red Records, but that's
okay.
Ours was it goes back to that Human League thing where we did Sound of the Crowd and we were called SoundCrowd, and the name Red Records came from where the Human League sort of split up and became two bands, Human League and Heaven 17. The Human League used this color code scheme on the next few releases, and Red Records signified a dance record. So the first one was that record, Sound of the Crowd. So that's why we call our label Red Records. But yeah, we just coincidentally, we had an act signed to the label, and they had done a track which should use the same vocal sample that Tony used. Tony had a hit on PWL with his tune Burning Up in 1995, and he did a couple of other hits that year with the 99th Floor Elevators, and I think the follow up to Burning Up as a hit as well. Our record didn't actually it didn't make the UK charts. We got to the position of number 76, and at the time they only published a top 75. But we got to number 76 in the UK charts based on just sales in Northern Ireland, because the record was getting played. It was getting played a lot on Irish radio, which people in the north could hear. And to put that into context, The Dawn, which is probably the most famous hard house tune of all time, its chart peak was number 75, so we were only a position away from The Dawn. All of these, that's something I just checked out in the last couple of days. I was trying to see if our sixth season was logged. There's a website called officialcharts.com. If you're a geek like me and you like chart positions and you like music history, it's a great free resource. You can basically put in any record from the last 60, 70 years and put it in. It'll tell you how many weeks it was on the chart, what its highest position was, etc., etc. So Tony had quite a few chart hits. So that's just another one of those coincidental things that happened along the way. In 1995, myself and Timmy sort of went our separate ways, as often happens when people are living in each other's pockets for 24/7. So he went off and he set up a new label. I continued DJing over the next couple of years. The number of venues in Dublin at that stage, the Olympic Ballroom had been shut down by the courts in 1994. There was a big raid one night, a big Garda raid one night, and it lost its license over the raid and the arrest made on the night. It wasn't as wild as some of the other venues in the city at the time, but however, it was shut down. All three of the sort of initial venues in Dublin in that era were all kind of shut down by the guards. But that wasn't necessarily a totally negative thing, because what happened was the next wave of clubs that came along were much better run. Were run by proper promoters and people that put in proper sound systems, and everything was just done a little bit more professionally and moved up to the next level. And it was just a natural thing that occurred. So venues that we when the Olympic closed, myself and Tim, we said, right, well, we've got to put on a gig somewhere. And we put on a gig in a venue called the Ormond Multimedia Centre. It had been open a few months. It was kind of basically a disused print works, a little bit like the Telegraph building in the Belfast. I'm not sure if you've ever been there. Okay. But we did a night there that was basically sold out, and it was on the same night that Ireland won the Eurovision, just a couple of miles down the road. It was the first night that Riverdance was performed in Dublin, and we had like 1,400 ravers in the Ormond Multimedia Centre, and that was a special night. We recorded that live, and that became what, like DJ mixtapes. The live recording on tape of that gig was huge. Sold bucket loads of that back in the day, but it just went down in history as just a momentous night. And a couple of weeks later, then the other promoters started going into that venue, putting on gigs with people like Entrance and JX and what have you, and it took off. It was it was only there for a couple of years, but it was one of the great venues, and it's where Tony's second Irish gig was when he came over in Paddy's weekend in 1997. and he was on the lineup with Tall Paul, and they sold out the Ormond Multimedia Centre, and such was the demand for tickets that they put on a second night, the next night, in a club called System, which was a 1,000 capacity club with usually a kind of a more a different kind of crowd to the Ormond Multimedia Centre, and they pretty much sold out System as well. And that at that time, that was a big deal in Dublin, that the same two DJs played two huge clubs in the city, one night after the other, and managed to sell the two of them out. They weren't the last to do it, but they were probably one of the first to do it. And they were very, very special nights. They were very, very special nights. And
I don't suppose you recorded that one, did you?
I think somebody did. I think DJ Orbit did. Yeah, I think that does exist somewhere. It's mad because I can still tell you like half of the records Tony played that night and half of the records that Paul played that night. It's amazing. I can't remember what happened last week, but I can tell you what records were played those nights. That's the joy of music, isn't it? But at stage, I mean, as I say, in '96, we brought Tony over. By that stage, would have been familiar with the other sort of trade DJs, but I'd never been to trade at that point. I did go for the first time in 1997, but you started noticing, like you were getting a lot of remixes by Tony. You started noticing records by Steve. Malcolm was still making tunes. So the trade just became, this is a rabbit hole. We need to go down and find out what's going on there. And all of the DJs in trade were very welcoming to me. And when I did my first track, it would have been probably recorded in '97 and released in 1998. I sent it around to a few people, and Ian didn't just send me back a reaction sheet as you got in those days. Ian actually sent me back a DJ mix with the track in the mix, and he went, "There, that's what I thought of your track. I put it in my new mix," which was pretty cool. I had I have a great friendship with Ian. That's
such a good guy.
Yeah, he is indeed. And the first gig that I got booked to play in London was in 1998, and it was on a lineup with Ian and Rachel Orborn. And I'm jumping about, I know, with the story, but I'll come back to that gig maybe in a minute. But yeah, in 1997, by then, like I have to say, I was a big fan of trance, and I was a big fan of all the Paul van Dyk stuff at that time. A lot of stuff that was coming out of Germany. So I hadn't fully maybe gone down the hard house route, but there was an awful lot of, certainly in Ireland, there was an awful lot of DJs playing trance and playing the sort of new progressive sound. Sasha and Digweed were starting to take off. And maybe it was because hard house or records made by DJs in the UK, like the trade DJs, were easier to mix. I'm not sure. I don't remember making that conscious decision, but I just found that more and more of the tunes on my set were sort of coming from that era. In 1997, I suppose the other big turning point for me was I got signed to a national radio station. It was only the second pop station in Ireland. It was the first sort of independent national radio station. At that time, it was called Radio Ireland, but it's now called Today FM. And on a Friday night and a Saturday night, on a Friday night, they put on a guy called Donald Scannell playing hip hop and lots of alternative sort of dance music. And then on a Saturday night, I played like 5 hours of tunes, and 2 hours of that was a mix, which went on from 3 a.m. till 5 a.m. And that just took off around the country. It was sort of a new thing. Like, you didn't hear dance music on the Irish Airways, the legal Irish Airways, up until that point. There were lots and lots of pirates around, but this was the first time that dance music was all night on a legal dance station. It just took off. I was getting bookings all over the country, and over the course of, say, that show only ran for a year. The station lost a lot of money in its first year, and I think the Moneymen came in and looked at me and Donald and said, "Why are we paying these guys who are on the middle of the night more than we're paying some of the daytime radio DJs?" And the reason for that was simple. When they asked me to do the gig, I said, "Well, I normally DJ on a Saturday night, so you'll need to pay me what I get paid to play in a club." And they said, "Yeah, no problem." But 9 months later or a year later, the Moneymen said, "Oh, we can't have this." So but by that stage, I was getting bookings. Like, I was playing all over Ireland, and everything had really took off. And over the sort of period of the radio show, the 2-hour mix that was sort of central in the middle became very tradey and very sort of hard housey. The first hour would have been sort of chunkier stuff like the Sharp Boys and Malcolm Duffy stuff and Steve Thomas stuff. And then the second half of it would have been the more high octane stuff. Not just trade DJs. Like there was a lot of really good European stuff made at that time, but stuff that Tall Paul was making, stuff that Tintin Out were making, it became very much, I'd gone down that route without sort of realizing it. And the trance stuff and the epic progressive house stuff, we still played on the radio show, but it was kind of outside that mix. So as a result, my DJ sets kind of reflected what was played on the radio show mix as well, because that's what people were booking you for. So yeah, musically, that's maybe how the journey into sort of playing sets that were predominantly hard house. I mean, that to me, that's the golden era of what we now call hard house. And the music of all of that music from Holland at the time, the Clubhead stuff, a lot of the German trance stuff on labels like No Respect, and then all the UK stuff. The UK stuff was always easier to mix for whatever reason. A lot of the people making records in Europe weren't necessarily DJs, so their records weren't necessarily DJ friendly. And I suppose in that era, the Baby Doc and the Dentist stuff and the Protocol stuff was huge, and Huge Tunes obviously was a big label. And yeah, John and Quinn stuff, the Baby Doc and the Dentist stuff was, when you heard those records for the first time, it was like, wow, this is new. This is new. This is
even different. When you hear them now, it's like, wow.
Yeah. So I mean, that stuff was called new energy then. It wasn't called hard house. Nobody called it hard house then. The first time I heard the hard house phrase, and I think this is similar to the story that Andy Farley told you, was I was doing columns for Irish magazines and newspapers sort of throughout the 90s and much of the noughties as well. And I interviewed Steve Thomas. I'm not sure if it was late 97 or early 98. And I'd already interviewed Tony. He featured in the magazine quite a lot. And the magazine was hot press. It was the only kind of Irish music magazine, still is the only Irish music magazine. And Steve, I asked him to describe the sort of wide array of music that was played in trade from the DJs, Malcolm Duffy, Alan Thompson himself, E&M, TDV, and at that stage, I think Pete Warman had taken over from Tall Paul in the last slot of the running order. And Steve said, it's hard house. It's house that's harder. That's what it is. And he was the first person I heard using that phrase at that time. And I still have all the magazines to kind of refer to and lots of records. At that time, hard house was used a lot by American DJs like DJ Pierre and Armand Van Helden, and they described their tough kind of tribal house as hard house. And that would be in 95, 96. And Malcolm would have played a lot of that stuff in trade, and Steve would have played some of that stuff. And Tony was a fan of some of that stuff. But when I asked Tony the same question to describe all that music, he called it warp house. He didn't call it hard house. And that, I suppose, leads on to 1998, which is where a lot of people in the UK would have been first introduced to me or my name. Was I basically went to Music Magazine and I asked them, could I do reviews? And I basically I had a pop at them because they had a column called a hardbag column. Now, they were the only magazine now M8 used to cover sort of harder music, but Mix Mag and DJing magazine was very much all about that kind of cooler progressive house, epic house sound. That was kind of, they didn't take the harder, faster music seriously. It didn't get any coverage whatsoever until Dan Prince, to his credit, in Mixmag, started banging on about Tony quite a bit. And Tony, obviously, at that stage in 96, 97, he was playing kind of clubs like Chuff Chuff, and he was playing Cream, and he was playing, mainstream venues. It wasn't just the kind of tough underground clubs in London that he was playing. And Dan Prince was the only one giving him coverage and giving him props. But in general, that music was ignored by the Pete Tong radio show on BBC One, by every other radio show on the BBC, that is, and by all the magazines. Kiss FM in London stood out. That was different. Pete Warman had a radio show, daytime radio on Kiss FM, and he was playing harder, faster music. Actually, Pete Warman played our SoundCloud record. It was on PWL and had a competition one afternoon, we were told, where Pete asked listeners to vote for which was the best bit of the record, which was cool. There you go. Another dot joined. The Kiss FM stuff, it is important. Pete, I think, did an essential mix before Tony. Tony gets all the credit for his essential mix. I think did he do two? I'm not sure. But Pete's mix, I think, was first, and that was game changing. You never heard music like Pete played on BBC Radio 1, and it was a lot of that Clubheads kind of European stuff, and then some of the UK stuff as well. And if people haven't heard that mix, it's on YouTube. You should check it out. It's really, really good. Pete was a really big, important DJ, I think, in the development of the whole scene. So
he was for me, because he's the guy that got me into it.
Yeah,
his Trade 4 mix was the thing that got me into hard house.
Very good, very good. And he was another excellent mixer, like they all were. So that was 1998, and so the editor, the reviews editor of music at the time, he took what I said seriously, and I said, listen, the thing was, maybe people in the UK called the music hardback, but I kind of made the point that Music was a magazine that was selling in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and that when you read that hardback column, it was very much it was sort of written for the sort of London gay club scene, and it was very much the camp sort of high energy and tough house that was being played in those clubs. But my point was that was only the case in England. The rest of England may have been ignoring that music, but in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, and in Ireland, three very different scenes, and to a certain degree in Wales too, people love that music. And maybe it's the Celtic blood in the Scotch and the Irish audiences. I'm not so sure if that's the reason, but harder, faster music was huge in Scotland, it was huge in Ireland, and it was huge in Northern Ireland, and nobody called it hardback. Like, that was a cringe term. Kind of like the association with handbag house, which was a big thing in mainstream clubs at the time. So they took that on board, and they said, okay, well, we have readers in all four countries, and at that point, like, the myth is that Tony took sort of the music of the gay London underground out into the mainstream, and to a certain degree that's true in England, but he didn't need to do that in Scotland. He didn't need to do it in Ireland. Everybody in Ireland already loved that music and have been the dominant sort of dance floor music for a number of years. So the guys in Music, to their credit, they took that on board, and the column became the first column with the name Hard House on it. Mixmag and DJ in the ensuing months followed and added Hard House reviews to their magazines as well. I'm not saying that's anything to do with me, by the way, but that's just how I remember it happening. And by 1998, the Music, I started interviewing people. They used to have a small sort of box, and you'd be interviewing people like the Tidy Boys, and again, Music magazine, to their credit, they took it seriously. I think the Tidy Boys were the first interview that we did, because at that stage they were releasing stuff like UK Gold, Nuclear Shard, the Die Witness record, which is, I think, the record that you said was one of the most influential, Ian's mix of Die Witness. And I remember a guy called Simon Paul, who went on to be known as Lost Witness, a trance producer, Lost Witness.
Oh yeah.
He ran the promo office for Tidy, and I remember ringing him up or emailing him and saying, like, who are these guys? Who's making all these records? And he said, it's all Amadeus and Andy and Paul. It's Paul James. Paul doesn't get the credit, in my opinion, that he deserves. Maybe because he disappeared off the scene for a couple of years in the early noughties. But like, Paul James was Hard House for me for a certain period. All that untidy dub stuff that took off, that was Paul James. It was just Paul James. And like all of those remixes that they did, that was down to that Funky Groove track, which was groundbreaking. I can remember hearing that record for the first time, because it was like nothing else at the time.
Well, I'm pretty sure the Die Witness, like Ian, the stuff Ian was doing, he was doing with Paul.
Yeah.
So I was lucky enough to work with him as well, like in the early 2000s. Lovely guy. Introduced me to my accountant in the UK, actually.
Very good. But yeah, I'd gone on to the Tidy Guys and said to Simon, like, who are these guys, and can I interview them for the magazine? And then the guys from Music the next month went, they actually rang me up and gave me the heads up, and they said, those guys you interviewed last month at Tidy Boys, we've had a lot of emails in that one of them was Jive Bunny. Are you okay if we like take them down a peg or two on the next issue? And I was like, listen, I didn't know that. I never knew they made the Jive Bunny record, but it made sense because Tidy was owned by Music Factory. It was quite funny. They just took the mick a little bit in the following edition. But in those early days of the magazine, and was interviewing people like Paul King, OD404 were starting to take off. And I did those reviews for the next 4 or 5 years through a succession of editors. It ended up being me and Dave Fowler was the other guy. We used to sort of share the reviews. And under the name Hard House, and that was in 1998. And I suppose that was a big turning point. I did my first record then, as I said to you. I'd recorded it, I think, in '97. I sent it off to a few labels. Positiva was one. Got a nice letter back from, I can't remember if it was Dave Cross, who was A&R for Positiva at the time, or whether it was Nick Hawkes who ran the label, who I knew from the earlier sort of Prodigy XL days. And they just said, yeah, you're heading in the right direction, keep up the good work, far from the finished product. And it was a very rough and ready record. It maybe didn't have enough post-production on it. But it was released by a record label in Ireland called Abbey Dance. It was the first record on Abbey Dance, and it became a top 30 pop hit in Ireland, which is bizarre looking back on it now. And there is a Circle is Complete element to that particular story, which I'll come back to when we get to talk about Charlatan, as I'm sure we will down the line. So yeah, I'd sent that record. I sent it to Steve and Tripoli Tracks. That was the label I really wanted to get a release on. That was my favorite label at the time. I think they thought it was a little bit too hard. This was pre-F1. They hadn't put out the F1 record, and that obviously changed how Tripoli did a lot of stuff. But yeah, Tony, as I said, I got an email on St. Patrick's Day 1998 asking me if I would like to release the track with them. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, so I ended up putting it out myself. And then I went and recorded a second track, which was called Bad Boy. And I sent that off to a few labels. And the original mix of Bad Boy isn't really a Hard House track. And people probably assume the Razor Babes mix is the original mix. It's not, obviously. It was kind of like it sampled an old hardcore record. Billy Bunter would be able to tell you which one it was. Yeah. And Stress Records at the time were setting up a new label for this new harder, faster music that was sort of starting to be taken a little bit more seriously by people in the UK media around 98. And they asked me, could they put it out? And they came back and said, there's actually one of the samples that we used, there's really bad distortion on that. Can you re-record it and get rid of that distortion? But this was the pre-digital era. For me to go and re-record that track meant like booking flights and going back to a studio in the UK. Oh. And it was just like more trouble than it was worth. So that track just sat there maybe for a while. And eventually, I put out the first two that I'd done in 1997. After Tony's untimely passing, I put out, they were called Kick Some Ass and Funky Monkey, and I put them out myself, pressed up 1,000 copies, sold them, said, okay, might as well put the other one out. And when it came to putting Bad Boy out, I got in touch with a guy called Rob Burns, maybe someone you should get for your podcast. I haven't heard Rob's name in a long, long time. He used to do a lot of stuff with PK. I think they might have had a bit of a bad falling out. And he was sort of one half of the Razor Babes, and I rang him up and I said, listen, I'm loving all the Razor Babes stuff. Would you do a remix for me? And sent over the parts to Ben. Sent over the parts to Rob, and he sent them on to Ben. And I got back the Razor Babes mix of Bad Boy, which, in Ben's words, became a huge hit in trade because he went down and he gave it to Ian or someone, and he watched it over the following weeks, getting played every week. And those two I put out as a sort of a double A-side single again on my own label, Baby Doll, in 1998, maybe 1999, can't remember. And again, sold out the complete run, and they did well. It was job well done. And I remember going off the point now, but it is a kind of a funny story. Ben, a few months later, saying to me, I'm going to remake that remix that I did for you. And I think at that stage, he might have had his little falling out with Rob. And he did. He went off and he remade it. And he cheekily, in my opinion, but nonetheless, it is funny looking back on it now, he replaced the Bad Boy vocal sample with a vocal sample that said Badass. And that was from a Mickey Finn and Urban Takeover record. I think that was the last vocal sample that Ben used. I remember he told me I think he might have got into a bit of trouble for it. And from then on, he used to do the vocal samples himself. The voice on Revolution is Ben. The voice on Baby Wanna Ride is the receptionist to Nucleus Records. So yeah, he remade it and he did it as Badass, and it took off. And then James Lawson did a remix that was even bigger, I think. And then he took that riff and he used it again in the KY Jelly Babies mix of Access. So yeah, that was Bad Boy made its mark on Hard House in a number of ways.
Wow.
But the record obviously was then re-released by Triple E down the line. So by 1998, I suppose, I was starting to get known as a hard house DJ, which is probably the very long-winded end of the answer to your first question. How did I get involved?
Yeah, it was an hour ago.
Billy Bunter, reach your heart out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but it's definitely interesting. So, would you, like back in Ireland, would you play Temple Theatre?
Oh, I did. Yeah.
I thought you must have. Yeah.
So you may not remember this, but I had sent you Charlatan, which I made that was probably the last record I made and released under my own name. 4 years later, in 2002, or maybe it was 2003, and you were playing at Temple Theatre, and I met you either on the way in or the way out, and I'd sent you the track, and you didn't bite initially, as they say, and you said to me, "Oh, I was playing with Andy Farley last night in London, and he played your track Charlatan last. Is that still available for signing?" And I said, "Oh, it sure is, yeah." So that's Temple Theatre is where Charlatan made its move to Vicious Circle. But that was a great club. Did you play the Crypt, or did you just play the big room upstairs?
I played a few times, and usually the Crypt. I played the main room. I think I only played the main room once. I was usually downstairs. But that suited me. I like that, because it was all those stone pillars, like to sort of walk.
Yeah,
right. Interestingly, Charlatan, when I did my 5-hour set in Sheffield in November, played it there. I've not played it in years. I mean, I've not played anything in years, really. When in preparation for that set, Ben had given me because I gave all my vinyl away. I've had no records for 20 years, 15 years, 14 years. And so I had to get all the stuff back. So I got all the Vicious Circle stuff. Maddox gave me a USB with almost all the Triple E back catalogue, which I enjoyed a couple of weeks of just listening to. But I'd forgotten how much good stuff you'd done.
Cheers.
Some of your stuff but in fact, and I can't remember which one it is. I need to go back and listen through, because we're launching. I don't know if you remember. We had a label called Resurrection that I think we only did 2 or 3 releases on it. We did Meltdown as the first one. Plowman's Lunge, the Baby Doc track. Me and Maddox did a remix on that. That might have been it. But we've decided a couple of weeks ago we're going to relaunch that label, but instead of Resurrection, it's going to be Hard House History. So the podcast is going to have a record label as well. But there's one of the tracks, I don't know if you would have the rights to it again, but there's one of yours that I would like to try and get for that. So I'll speak to you about that later. But cool. It was. But I'd forgotten how much good stuff you've done. But just in general, like Triple E is the best hard house label.
Yeah, to me, that's still the case, especially from the era that maybe it did go quite hard and quite fast, and I wouldn't maybe has been a big a fan of some of that stuff, but certainly the first 100 releases or the first 70 or 80 releases, they hardly put a foot wrong. They were very good to me. The guys that ran the label, Tarek and Ziad was obviously a great DJ, as well as being A&R for the label. He used to play trade quite a bit. Played with him quite a lot in Ireland. But Triple E, I did a compilation CD with them. It was around the time when all the Hard House Euphoria stuff started getting released.
I remember, 2001, I think.
Welcome to the Club. So Steve did one disc and I did the other. Trade ended up being a big thing in Ireland, not in gay clubs, just in all the bigger rave venues in the country, and I sort of did all of those gigs as well, and played with Ian and played with Steve and what have you. Got a remix released on Trade as well. There's actually a Join the Dots thing between me and you on that, where it was one of those studio sessions in London, did like 3 tracks in 2 days kind of thing, and the last one was a remix of a track for the Trade label, and I sent the 3 tracks that I did to just a handful of people. Usually back then it would have been, say, Andy or Ben, and Ben rang me up and he went, "Oh, you see that remix you've done for Trade?" He said, Paul Glazby's just a remix of Eternal for Nucleus, so you can't put that out." And I said, "Oh God, I didn't know that." And he went, "Yeah, that was the first ever release on Nucleus." And he said, "Glazby's just done a mix." And I said, "Oh, right, okay, yeah." So I'd sampled the original Carl Cox record, which I used to play in the Olympic Ballroom back in 1992, 1993. Anyway, Lawrence, who ran Trade or owned Trade, he sorted it out with Peter Pritchard, and they let the mix go out with the sample, and it was all it was all nicely done. But yeah, sort of getting a release on Trade was like a dream come true for me. I got to play in the club a few times as well, and that was a dream come true. But the DJs that all of them, I think maybe don't get enough credit. Sometimes the club gets too much of the credit. Tony certainly took that harder sound into more mainstream venues, but I think Pete was just as important with his Kiss FM show. Obviously, Tony had a show on Kiss FM too. Tall Paul, in the early days in Trade, he was kind of playing maybe not as tough a sound as the rest of the Trade DJs, but he was hugely important. But definitely Pete Warman with the radio show was hugely important. But Steve with Triple E Tracks, he was kind of steering the hard house ship in the UK for a number of years with his A&R role at that label, and he became a very close friend, and he was a great guy. And he himself and Ian are two of the best mixers I've ever seen in my life, where you could hand the two of them any record, two records they've never heard before in their life, and pull off the sweetest, flawless mix they've ever heard. Just two geniuses. Alan was probably one of the best house DJs I've seen. And Malcolm Duffy, when he was on fire, he was absolutely amazing. I saw him one night in Fabric in the back room at D2PM, and he played like the whole night, 5 hours. And he reminded me of Justin Robinson, because at the end of the night, all his records were out of their sleeves all over the place on the floor. Justin Robertson was often like that when he played in Ireland as well. The records would be everywhere. Malcolm, it was just unreal. He was super hot when he was on fire. He was really on fire, But yeah, they were all good guys, and they were all very, very good to me. And Tony, I became a big champion of Tony, I suppose. After his untimely passing, I wasn't a friend like Fergie, and I wasn't part of his sort of inner circle or whatever, but we'd obviously made connections and done gigs together in Ireland, played with him a few times in Ireland. And, Jane, at the end of the TDV 20 event in Birmingham, I'm not sure, I think you wouldn't have been necessarily at that one, but I got a compliment from Jane, and she said, probably over the last couple of decades, you've been the biggest champion of Tony and his music. And I just wanted to thank you from on behalf of me and the family. And that would have been the case. I'm not sure if Jane would say the same now, nearly 10 years later. And that's not because I've changed my views or anything. It's just I maybe don't shout it from the rooftops anymore. I thought that to me, the TDV 20 event drew a nice line under it in terms of events and in terms of a celebration of Tony and his music.
Yeah,
it did. It was a real nice, flamboyant mix of all walks of life at that party. And then the TDV 25 a few years later, like the event itself, maybe it didn't live up to what had gone before, but there was obviously the erection of the plaque for Tony outside the studios in Birmingham, and that was a special occasion, and that was really nice to be part of that and to be there for that. And that to me was another thing that maybe drew a line under Tony as legacy. I think he's made his mark, but music moves on. I think to say that he was the greatest DJ of all time, like he would be my favorite DJ of all time. But I'm not sure that you could say he's the greatest DJ of all time. On what criteria would you judge that? Like any DJ who was around in the 90s, myself, Tony, or otherwise, like the success that people had then, even the biggest DJs in the UK, it's dwarfed by the huge success that people have now, like clubbing now and DJs now, what they achieve. So to say that someone from the 90s was the greatest of all time, it's kind of like, what are you basing that on? What are you judging that on? But in terms of favorite DJs, or in terms of cultural impact, Tony had a huge cultural impact.
For sure. Yeah. And I think it's not even a fair comparison, because like now with social media and the way that things can be distributed, I think for Tony to make the name for himself and like you said before, his career, he'd been doing it for a long time, but Tony to be the hard house DJ, let's say, was not a long period of time, 3-4 years. To have the impact that he did without social media, without file sharing, without, there was none of that. So I guess, compared to, if you look at the avenues that people have now to be able to get the name out there, it kind of puts into perspective the impact that because what impact would he have had if he was around now? You know, like with the you know, so it's you can't really.
But I've said it already, but one of the things that maybe gets forgotten about in the midst of time is how hard it would have been for him to establish himself outside of that sort of underground club scene in London and get taken seriously by the bigger promoters. Like the dance industry in the UK at the time was very much controlled by an elite few, and they did not want this harder, faster music in the clubs, and they certainly didn't want it in the magazines or on the radio. And he somehow, through all of that, managed to become the busiest and biggest DJ in the UK, and that's an achievement. That to me is probably his biggest achievement. You know.
Well, I mean, you can't sort of argue what the people like, can you? That's the thing. I mean, the powers that be can try and do whatever they want, but if you go and play to a bunch of kids that fucking love what you do, then you know you're just going to steamroll it eventually. So I guess that's what he did. Mate, I feel like we could go for another hour, but I mean, I've said this. In fact, I need to have just like a banner that comes up at the bottom of the screen because I said this at the end of every episode, but I'll say it to you. I thought that when people came on this podcast, they were going to come on once and then that'd be it. But I really think you would be great to get back on again. So if you're up for it at some point, I think let's do, because there's a lot I think that we've not even touched on yet.
I did promise viewers earlier in this podcast to sort of join the dots between my first tune, which was called Kick Some Ass, and Charlatan, which was obviously the label I was thrilled to have released on your label. And I know at the time when it was released, there were certain people that maybe criticized the fact that it used the sample from E&M's Crazy Pills, which is, in my opinion, one of the best Vicious Circle releases and one of the best hard records ever made. I actually think it's Ian and Paul's finest era. Others, you know, that's obviously a subjective view. I just love that record so much. And how that came about and how it joins the dots with that first record is when I did the original mix of Charlatan, we actually originally wanted to record it at 160 BPM. I just felt that everything was getting really hard and fast at that time. And it was kind of like, we'll just do this for a joke and do a track that's 160 BPM. We actually chickened out and brought it back to 156. But I used the same kick drum sample that I'd used in that very first track, Kick Some Ass, 4 years previously. And you signed it, but you came back to me after a couple of weeks and you said to me, there's 16 bars just before the breakdown where it kind of maybe loses its momentum. Would you be able to add in a couple of elements there? And I said, okay, fair enough. We went back in to do it. And when we went back in to do it, the guy that I did the track with, a lovely chap called Kieran Rafferty, when he came to doing the mix down, he couldn't get that. It was kind of like a GABA kick drum from the original, and he couldn't get it to sit with the bass line the way it did on the original version that I would have sent you. And we spent hours and hours, and I really, really wanted for a Circleist complete moment, I wanted that same kick drum from the first record to be on that record, but we couldn't make it happen on the day. And so we've been in the studio for hours, and I think he was getting frustrated with me because I didn't really have any, every other kick drum we tried, I didn't want to use. I was like, nah, that's not good enough. It needs to be a GABA kick drum. And so eventually we were just about to kind of call it a day. And I said, you know what? Let me make a phone call. And I went out and I phoned or texted E&M and I said, listen, do you mind? I'm having trouble in the studio doing a track. I really need, a really tough kick. Would you mind if I sampled the first few bars of Crazy Pills? And he said, no problem, go ahead. So I did. Sample it, but I sampled it with his permission. And I sent it to him probably at the same time as I sent it to you, and it says it's okay. And he went, whoa, you really took it lock, stock, and barrel, didn't you?
Nice. Well, I never knew that.
But there you go. That's the Circleist complete story. So you were instrumental in maybe taking that track from, because I did give the two versions to Ben when he did your Vicious Circle USB, and there are, like, if anyone wants to compare the two and check them out, both versions are on that Vicious Circle USB-C. Yeah. Right.
Well, I've got another story to add to that to bring the circle even more. So Crazy Pills, the first version of Crazy Pills that Ian and Paul sent, it actually had the key change straight out of the break. So as it kicked back in with the key change on the bass.
Right.
And I just didn't like. I loved the track, but I just did not like that part. And I went back to the guys and said, "I love it. I'll sign it, but you've got to change that. I can't have that key change where it is." And to their credit, they took it on the chin and changed it, and that's what we put out. So I fucked their track up as well.
But that helped it along, because it actually works really well where it is now. I never heard it.
Yeah.
I never heard it the other way, so I can't compare the two.
Yeah.
But but no.
Yeah,
I think,
it was one of those things as well at the time, because I remember thinking, I'm telling Paul Janes and E&M to change something in their track, but I thought, I've got to say it. I had to do it, and yeah, I mean it worked out, and they were cool about it. But yeah, so that's a connection there as well.
Yeah. Well, cheers. Yeah, I enjoyed today. I probably waffled on a little bit, and maybe
it's been great.
Maybe the viewers will have to join their own dots just to make sense of all of that. But yeah, I'd love to come back on again. Yeah, definitely.
Excellent. Well, we'll definitely do it. Well, Mark, thanks for your contribution to the scene that we all love, and thanks for your time today. And I look forward to seeing you again.
Cheers. Thanks, Paul.
Nice one, mate. You take care.
You are listening to Hard House History with Paul Glazby.